Well, let me just a point of personal privilege. I had the honor of serving as President Obama's chief technology officer in the first term, and we had been investing in quantum computing modestly. I don't. You all will give me feedback about whether we did enough, do more. We'll leave that as a side. But it has been kind of consistent policy across the the various administrations that having a coordinating office and encouraging these sort of leapfrog investments is something that we want to continue to do. America's best when we invest in the building blocks of an innovation economy, and this is one very important, very technical aspect. The topics I was keen to grapple with today, in addition to having our guests introducing themselves, is to talk a bit about the following: the ambitious but achievable. I think we heard some of this in the conversations already, but as we get to where we are on these technical roadmaps, understanding what meets the bar of ambitious but achievable, that is something I'm very keen to encourage the group to share some feedback on. Number one. Number two, we're going to be talking a bit about lab to market. In the Obama administration, we did work on a number of steps, identifying barriers and then steps to tackle those barriers more broadly, how we can take research, even early stage research, and find off-ramps along the way. I know that remains an important priority in the quantum field, a lot of opportunity, but not an obvious pathway to immediate lab to market use cases, but would love to engage. And then obviously the important role of public-private partnerships. Along the way, are there opportunities for more participation, maybe from the attendees at this summit, a broader set of stakeholders? And then lastly, what we can do to think of a call to action. If Chicago will emerge as this hub to drive, kind of the industry's collective success here, what might we do together more than we're doing today? So what I'd love to do is, we've got a great panel. Maybe we just go through, Kevin, if you'd be so kind as to get us started, share a bit about your introduction from you to the group, but more specifically thinking about answering that question, the ambitious to achievable, as you say those introductory remarks, and then we'll go down the list.
Aneesh, thank you. I'm Kevin Callaghan. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of QuantFi. QuantFi is a startup quantum computing software company. We're based in Paris, France, a long way from Chicago, but it's a global market, and that's one of the insights. I want to make sure people understand. I am not a scientist, so it's difficult for me to talk about the research as clearly as others on this panel. I'm an entrepreneur, and what we do is we do research. We do some products development. I wouldn't say we have products that we offer, but most of them are in development. And we collaborate. We do have paying clients, even though we've been around just a little bit over a year. But those are, I would say, collaborations where clients know that we're doing work on their behalf, and our goal is to become a leader in quantum computing software for finance. So our specialty is finance, and we're looking at both what we call quantum inspired technology and pure quantum technology. We spent a lot of time in the last year talking to clients worldwide, in person when we were able to travel, and now virtually when we can't. And we're getting a lot of feedback. I'm sure others are hearing this feedback too, that there are different approaches. Every company has their own use cases, their own problems, their own timing as far as when they feel the time is ready to spend money. And money, unfortunately, is what they're going to have to spend. So we're finding it's the largest financial institutions in the world that are a little bit ahead of the curve, like JP Morgan, Chase, Goldman Sachs, a few others. But in terms of if we want to talk about academic side, which is what I was prepared to discuss, or the way we create a corporate academic ecosystem involves really trying to solve problems for our clients, whether near term or long term, whether quantum or classical. We call that quantum inspired now, although there are there were in fact classical solutions with state of the art algorithms, and we find solutions by often working with academia. So our company has 5 business people running the company, but we've got 8 researchers who are both advisors and employees of the company. And we have 6 students who are in PhD programs or what we call postdocs, who are recent graduates who have joined us. So we're heavily loaded on research. And again, that's a model I think most companies like us are following. One of the reasons for that, one of the advantages I would say of that for us in France is that it's hard to find good tax breaks here in the EU. But that's one of them, is to be designated a deep tech company and to be able to get reimbursements for a lot of the salaries and taxes that we would normally pay as a corporate entity in France. Can I do what is this my time? So should I finish my thoughts, or do you want me to come back to you on other thoughts later?
Yeah, why don't you finish? I was hoping to do this sort of initial introduction amongst the group, and then we could have a dialogue. But please continue.
Okay. Well, if I have more time, then yes. So what I prepared to talk about was really how we handle this public-private, if you will, or the academic-corporate relationship. And we found in the last year that it's for some of the reasons I mentioned, it's quite efficient for us, cost-effective for us to work with universities and to find different ways to collaborate with them. So there are the standard what I call studentships, which some also call corporate PhD programs, where we identify students who are interested in pursuing a PhD in quantum science, and we hire them part-time. There's actually a pretty successful program here in France called CIFRA, where PhD students are working for companies while studying for a PhD. And this gives us 2 to 3 days a week for a student scientist to work with us. It also allows us to use those relationships at the university to sort of lure, I would say, more quantum scientists into our field. Finance, many know it has not been the most popular field in quantum science, and even in quantum computing. I think it's becoming a little sexier the last year or so, but it's still, not as many programs are really concentrating on it. So part of why we collaborate with universities and try to create these studentships and other relationships is to attract universities to what we're doing and get them to look at it. Because let's face it, finance is an applied field primarily. Its goal is to allow financial institutions to profit, although I think there are social goals as well, like making markets safer. So to avoid crashes, to avoid recessions and depressions, those are all good social goals. But I think the thought is that, especially in traditional countries like France, PhD students are fundamental researchers, and we want them to be both. We want them to because quantum science and quantum computing, as we just heard from Yianni, are long-term, in many cases 15, 20 years out. So we have to depend on long-term quantum research in quantum computing, but at the same time, we'll look for those near-term applications, which is in a way kind of the holy grail, at least over the next 3 to 5 years, is to find the quantum advantages that we can get through, again, maybe some combination of quantum computing and classical, what I call quantum inspired computing.
Yep.
And you want to cut me off now? Go ahead.
No, yeah. I really appreciated your comments. I realized maybe we kind of dove in pretty deep with you. I wanted the chance to say hello to the whole crew, just so we get the chance to say hello, and we'll come back. We've got a great group. Maybe given the handoff to the professors, we've got two from the University of Chicago, Bill and Liang. Would the two of you say briefly a bit about who you are as an introduction? And maybe, if you want to say something about what you view to be ambitious for the community, but achievable, I'd welcome a few opening remarks, and then we can come back to the deeper dives.
Definitely. So maybe I'll start. Do you guys hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Okay, excellent. So I'm Bill Fefferman. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Chicago. My focus is the theory of quantum computing. And I sort of try to approach this in my research from two sort of complementary avenues. The one hand, I'm really interested in sort of designing new quantum algorithms to solve hard problems. Right. But then I'm also sort of interested in a complementary question, which is...
You don't have the link to the panel. I'm sorry, I'm muting my mic.
Sorry. So I'm also interested in sort of a complementary question, which is what are the hardest problems that quantum computers can solve, and what can't they solve, right? And the reason I'm interested in that is because I'm particularly involved in sort of designing near-term post-quantum cryptographic schemes, which will be relevant, as soon as there are quantum computers, we need to understand how to protect our information against quantum computers. So these are sort of my two focuses. And I think I'll say that in particular, in the last maybe 6 or 7 years, my research has really changed quite a bit to try to be sort of more relevant to near-term experiment. So my focus today is really to try to make all of this theory that has been developed in quantum computing over the last 20 or 30 years much more relevant to what's actually going on, in near-term experiment. And it's sort of still a struggle where there's still a gap between experiment and theory.
Yes.
But that's sort of my focus, to try to minimize that gap.
Yes, and we're rooting for you. We're going to get into that in a few moments. Liang, do you want to carry the theme of professor? Do you want to just share a few words about the work you do and how you think about what may be ambitious but achievable in the field?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Liang, and I'm a professor at the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering at the University of Chicago. And I'm also like an Amazon scholar working with Amazon AWS. And so basically my research focusing on the theoretical investigation of quantum systems and explore like various quantum applications, such as sensing, communication, and computing. And so I think that major challenge for the field is basically we need like our realistic devices are not perfect. They have various kinds of noise and decoherences. And we need to develop like efficient quantum control protocols, and maybe in the long run, like error correction schemes to protect our quantum information from decoherence. And I think that what's kind of like ambitious and achievable, like in the next few years, would be like one aspect will be like better quantum sensors. And the other one will be like quantum networks, potentially can connect like remote quantum systems. And probably down the road, we will have like a scalable quantum computers. Yeah,
that's you right down the fairway. Thank you for that. That's a wonderful way of summarizing the possibilities. Yianni, you had a chance to say hello in the last session. Do you want to just maybe do a quick summary of what you shared there and as an introduction to this discussion?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm head of business development for Ware. We're a software quantum computing company. We specialize in building algorithms for quantum computers, and we don't specialize in finance per se. We look at many different algorithms in many different for many different industries and use cases. And I was going to say that maybe an ambitious but achievable goal is to have sort of the next version of this Google quantum supremacy experiment completed and done, right? So that was great. That was a great milestone, I think, for the field. It showed how we can produce something that beats the best-in-class classical approaches, can solve a real problem faster than any classical in any classical way. But we need to produce another one, right? So we need. I mean, that was great. We need to do another one. I think we're close to that. I think it's definitely definitely going to happen in the next maybe 2 to 3 years with the roadmaps that hardware manufacturers are producing and what they're producing. But we need to make sure it happens. I think that's the goal for the field.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few more guests. Pranav, do you want to go next at Super.tech?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on here. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Super.tech, which is a quantum software spin-out of UChicago with Professor Fred Chung, who you heard earlier this morning. So I actually just defended my PhD last month, so I'm really fresh out of the program out of UChicago. But I think in terms of ambitious but attainable goal, I'll echo something that Fred said this morning, which is this idea that we think that we can use quantum software to make quantum computing a reality 10 years faster than it otherwise might happen. And if I can just sort of crystallize this with a hot take. So our opinion is that the existing software stacks for quantum computing are a little bit too much like the software stacks that power your phone or your laptop, in that they assume that you have really good underlying hardware with billions of bits and perfect operations. And what we're trying to advance is this idea that there should be much more co-design between the software at the top and the hardware at the bottom, and that the ideal software on a quantum computer looks more like the software that you saw in the 1940s when Grace Hopper would have to be aware of whether a moth flew into a computer. And I think that's sort of where we are in the quantum realm today.
Very helpful. Thank you. Can I get Rafal to say a few words from Xanadu?
Absolutely. So I'm Rafal Janik. I head up the product side at Xanadu, and we're really focused on building quantum computers that are useful and available to people everywhere. We were, thrilled to deploy our first quantum computers on a public cloud just last month, and we're going to continue driving that in order to make more and more diverse quantum technologies available to people. I think, my ambitious but realistic goal is similar to what Pranav and Yianni both were saying. One of them is definitely driving this idea of a quantum advantage application. So how in the near term do we actually demonstrate that a quantum computer can do something useful that a classical computer can't, or at least do it better than a classical computer? And I do definitely share Pranav's view that this is only going to happen by a double effort, from the bottom up, pushing on the hardware and the capabilities there, and from top down on the software stack, making sure that algorithms and compilers are as efficient as possible to take advantage of current technology.
Thank you. We're going to come back to that theme of top down and bottom up, I think, which is wonderful. Can we round us home? I think, is it Raghu? Are you our last panelist? Are you with us?
Yes. Thanks, Aneesh. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this esteemed group. I am the Vice President at Discover Financial Services and manage data science team. Discover Financial Services, as you know, is one of the largest financial institutions within the Chicagoland. And when Brad reached out through P33, we were more than happy to be a part of this great research approach. From my perspective, I have two aspects to my job. My day job involves developing models within the financial sector for fraud, for AML, and for collections. And my other job, which my managers call me other job, is really the research job, which includes machine learning, and specifically two aspects of machine learning: explainability of machine learning and fairness and bias aspects evaluated with machine learning. Now, as we have been participating in these events, there are some common themes after hearing to Dr. Jan, Dr. William, everybody, right? There are common things and some low-hanging fruits which cross both academia as well as industry, like fraud, like AML. So my interest would be to see how quantum computing can help in, I don't know if the word is accelerating or optimizing, but when we look at all these algorithms like gradient search, I don't know if Yianni or somebody else from BCG was talking about it, optimizing the gradient search to utilizing graph networks to utilizing adversarial models, if you may. How can all of these worlds come together to have a good perspective of the massive amount of data we have? So that's about us.
That's terrific. Michelle is gathering some questions. Before we get to that, I want to just maybe get a group discussion facilitated around I love this theory about we need opportunities to improve upon the hardware stack, and we got to bring the software more accessible. Just a word or two about barriers, if I may. Can anyone wish to chime in? What are the, we could all look at this group and say, go for it, raise more, get more research funding and so forth. The question is, what other barriers are you identifying that are weakening our ability to both move from the top down and the bottom up? And I'll defer to anyone that wishes to raise their hand on commenting around the thematics around where we have barriers. I assume there's obviously stipulate the technical barriers, but there may be some non-technical barriers as well. Pranav, I saw your hand.
Yeah, and I guess this is both sort of a technical barrier and a conceptual or communication barrier, but I describe it as sort of the language of computer scientists versus the language of physicists. And in particular, one point that I'll make is that as computer scientists, we like to talk about qubits, quantum binary systems, but when you talk to the physicists, they never have like a binary system that's 0 or 1 in superposition. What you really have are technically infinite states. And so you can think about, instead of just having like a 2-level system, a bit, what if you can harness the higher level states, which we'd call a qtrit? And maybe at face value, this may seem like a fairly minor technical point, but I think the broader message behind this is that there's these really big gaps that happen when the computer scientists and the physicists are not sort of in the same room, exposed to the same sort of discussions and architectures. And so one step to address this barrier, I think that hardware companies are doing a really good job at this, at sort of recognizing this barrier and addressing it. So IBM, for example, now has this interface called OpenPulse, where they let computer scientists talk to their quantum system the same way that physicists do. And this lets us get around that barrier where previously computer scientists always had to work with these qubits. Now we can deal with them in terms of qtrits, qquarks, all these higher level systems. And I think maybe there's more work that's going to happen where the physicist language, if you will, merges with the computer science language. I'm sure other players are also thinking about this too, but I know IBM has done a lot of cool work here.
Anyone else wishes to chime in on this issue about barriers? I may have a follow-up as we go through, but feel free to raise your hand. And I'm trying to think of the best way to do this. Yianni, do you want to give us a comment? It's the power of Zoom meeting management.
I do want to, I mean, it's not a technical issue, actually. It is more on the funding side, because actually, if you look at what has happened on the hardware side over the last few years, maybe you can say we got to, a 20x improvement, right? So, hardware has essentially scaled 20 times, and then it's now 20 times better, right? And I think on the algorithm side, maybe the same is true. Maybe we can say that people designing new algorithms really have pushed the boundaries, and now algorithms can perform 20x better, right? As well, right? So on both sides, basically, we have 20x improvement. We still have a gap in between, but things have improved. My point is that we essentially got to the hardware 20x by spending in government and in industry, and vendors have spent maybe at least $1 billion. I think you can say easily billions of dollars, right? On the software side, I think we got to a 20x also, but maybe the government funding and the industry funding and the VC funding and the vendor funding has been maybe around a few $100 million, maybe a couple $100 million. So I think there's a big disparity there, right? So both of these initiatives can move the needle, right? They need to meet in the middle, and you have a very kind of very large difference in how they're funded and how much they're funded. Obviously, I do understand, obviously on the hardware side, you need to have labs, and the labs need to have equipment and everything. So that's absolutely right. But then you have some government funding, for example, that's only kind of dedicated to hardware, right? And there's basically no way to get into that, right, if you're a software company. So just wanted to highlight that we do see that as a barrier, and we do see that as an obstacle, right? That sort of software doesn't really get in many cases, a chance to be heard.
I will say, I see head nodding from William. Do you have a comment on that one?
No comment on funding, but I will try to take this conversation a little bit more technical, because from my perspective, there's sort of there's an obvious issue, I think, when you look at the disparity between sort of software implementations and then hardware implementations in the near term, and for me, this is all about noise, right? The fact that in our current hardware, we have, even if we want to implement a certain quantum program, we end up only implementing some very rough approximation of that program. And I think that, to have any chance of sort of having useful near-term applications, we're going to have to sort of understand that noise better, and we're going to have to be able to address to sort of have noise mitigation techniques built into our hardware. We don't have that yet to the extent that we need it. And I think this is by far and away the biggest barrier in the near-term era to sort of useful applications.
Rafal.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add maybe build on all three of those comments. The first one around the low-level access to the hardware that Pranav was mentioning is really interesting, because the diversity of hardware is growing, and it's probably going to grow even more in the coming years. It was mentioned that we don't know what the transistor of the quantum computing world is yet. And definitely Xanadu is taking a very different approach with being a photonic-based approach, but you're seeing now lots of different ideas on how to build the basic building blocks of a quantum computer, which I think makes the other side, especially the low-level software design side, incredibly difficult. Not only do you not know what targets you're building for necessarily, but also the amount of expertise that is required there on the specific substrate that the quantum system is built on is really high. So I would almost argue that maybe there's a little bit of premature optimization on that side happening already, where there's companies that maybe want to build the, one language to rule all quantum computers, where we don't necessarily know yet what that will look like. But I think there's tremendous amount of work to be done from the top side. Shor's algorithm, the way that it was envisaged originally, will probably never run on a quantum computer. But people have spent close to a decade now pushing the hardware barriers of what you need to run some version of that algorithm lower and lower to make it more and more realistic. And I think there's great work to be done from that side.
This is a fascinating conversation. Kevin, you had your hand up, and I want to make sure if we get a few more comments on barriers, we'll get into ways to tackle them. Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, just again, on the business side, I could offer these thoughts. I think staffing is potentially a problem long-term, because there's so much demand now for quantum scientists coming out of school, and yet there aren't enough graduates to meet that demand. So that's going to make it more difficult for companies to hire, especially the most qualified people. And I think related to funding, I agree with Yianni. Software companies aren't considered unicorns. It's the hardware companies that really get the most offers on funding, and that's a similar problem to staff. It makes it harder to stay in business. So, I think many of us are happy that the barriers to entry right now are fairly low for quantum startups, but that will change, and it's becoming more and more expensive. I mentioned in France how the tax benefits, well, I didn't say that, but they expire after a while. So you only have a window to actually kind of get that funding that's going to keep you in business for many years. And, there's I think the expression quantum winter, which is a point in time where perhaps the hype about quantum backs off and less people are interested in it, especially once they start to see a few failures, which we haven't yet seen. we'll see failures, we'll see consolidation, we'll see increased competition and therefore less collaboration. It's going to become a real competitive business I think, in the next few years, and that makes it very challenging for, I think, startups, especially ones founded on pure fundamental science, to survive.
Let me shift the conversation a bit. I really appreciate this sort of the hardware software divide. Andre in the chat did point out, and maybe if we broke the numbers down by source of funding, that maybe investors have been more roughly equal, as the comment from Andre about where their allocation has been. It's been maybe the government that's maybe been divergent. I'll take that as a personal piece of feedback. I'd love to hear sometimes, and maybe this gets a little bit about what's in scope for a proposal. To what extent today, and I think, we've got the White House announcement of the quantum, the report on the state of the industry, I assume many in the room have read or are familiar with. Is there a potential area of opportunity tied to this problem, if in fact that's the right way of framing it, around how to broaden the flexibility of spending to be able to sort of sit at the intersection of these top-down and bottom-up approaches? Maybe our academics, Liang and William, just assuming a lot of what you do is pursuing federal grants in these areas, maybe, I don't know, would love to get your feedback about whether the way the grants are encouraged, it's exacerbating some of these gaps, or are they coming to the point where you can bring those worlds together because they've become more flexible? Give me a flavor of what's happening on the funding stream, as Andre pointed out.
Yeah, maybe I can give some, at least my past experience of what's happening like in the recent years, is that I think that definitely we're getting more support and to investigate like a quantum, both at the fundamental level and also at the practical level, try to make things try to build something which potentially will be useful. And I think, since I'm a theorist, I guess that I'm mostly my funding support is to support the graduate student and postdocs. And I think that's, and I really appreciate that, getting all these supports to explore something that could be wide open, and we do find something interesting in there. And also more recently, I also getting some of the support from this more industrial side, and I think that's also really helpful and fruitful, and to also getting more conversations from I guess Fred also mentioned this co-design, which it'll be good to know what the problem is, and also from our more research side to think about what would be the kind of the solution to those questions. Yeah. So yeah, maybe.
Well, let's. Yeah. I mean, we're going to be eyes on Raghu for a moment, a little bit about your industry. You in theory are observing what's happening here, and you're thinking about where you place investments, and you're thinking about what to double down on. So the question is, to what extent might there be sort of a role for P33 to kind of help facilitate maybe the listening part of what you're looking for, and then the on-ramp, maybe linked it to some public project or public financing? Raghu, you're welcome to comment on this section, or we could maybe go one more round internally about how, in general, industry views the on-ramp into this ecosystem. Is it independently or aligned with public funding?
Maybe my answer will cross both those questions, Anish, if you don't mind, and then we can open it up to broader.
And no pressure, but you're about to write a check. Everyone's waiting for you to say we're putting out this in grant. But go ahead. Yeah.
So all these comments are based on my own opinion. So let me start with that comment first.
Yeah.
Like I was saying earlier, in industry, I think the common ground we are looking for is the most viable product, which is, goes back to your first question, which is the most achievable ambition we have right now. And to all the academicians here, some of those questions might seem pretty simple, but they're real practical questions which will need some research, right? So like I was saying earlier, anti-money laundering is one common goal, which all of us in the industry grapple with. right? I don't know if we have looked at this problem utilizing these techniques. The other is fraud. I think BCG mentioned that earlier in their slide about fraud applications, right? They are always, a few steps ahead of us, right? So, and then we get into this weird world of IP and whatnot. So I'm not going to go there. But these two for me would be an initial simple approach.
And Raghu, not to double down on this conversation, but maybe as a way to bring back the group, one of the interesting dynamics that I found in trying to facilitate public-private partnerships is that it's almost public-private-public. So let me explain. The Treasury Department regulates you on anti-money laundering. And there may be research labs funding a project that you may see an application to benefit, but your ultimate customer is Treasury. And are they involved in the R&D grants that help facilitate some of this? I'm curious how that flow of demand signal comes from, government, industry, government, but a different source. And might that be a way to unlock some of the potential here?
That's an excellent point. I will make a note of that. The thing though is that we are doing here as the right thing to do as a citizen, right? So as AML, these applications can go beyond our own institution. It is really the right thing to do across all the institutions, right? And then whatever comes out of these AML applications can then be graduated to fraud and vice versa, right? That's what I meant. And definitely we will, all of our financial institutions are heavily regulated. And one of the discussion point is always, AML. So it would be good to let them also know probably that, we are actively looking to do the best we can, right?
Yeah, so the analogy there, and I did post on the Q&A, someone asked the link to the White House report on quantum. I assume all of you have it, so I don't want to assume one way or the other, but it was just a few weeks ago posted, so I put that link in there. There is this dynamic where we have problems that we are trying to solve as a country and around the world. We assume within current technical constraint of an approach to solve these problems at a cost structure that incurs some tax on the society to get to a better place. This capability, I think, William, you kind of were highlighting this conversation about where we can go further. Maybe a translation function could be what problems that we solve today through sort of inefficient tech and we don't quite get to the finish line are good candidates for this, and how might that feedback loop through a P33 make its way into the public research agencies who may not be as sensitive to that demand signal? I don't want to put you on the spot, but any reaction to this feedback of how we get the demand signal, the near term, the off ramps, and all that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I have an immediate answer. I wish I did. What I'll say is that I think as a community, we've come a long way in the past 10 years from sort of an extremely theoretical community that was not very exposed to industry, was not very exposed to government, was not very exposed to any of these things, because we didn't have a lot of real world application of what we were doing. And we've sort of gone a lot further. So for example, I see this a lot in sort of post-quantum cryptography, where we're trying to come up with crypto schemes which will be resilient to quantum computers. Well, now everyone cares about this, industry, government, because we don't want our data to be to be hacked, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And I think this has come a very, very far way from and I've personally been sort of following the development of this, and we've seen this again and again, where in the beginning it was pure theory. No one thought there would be quantum computers, so no one particularly cared about the implementation. And now we're sort of working with industry, with government, to make sure that their needs for cryptography are sort of motivated by are rooted in our research, right? And I think you see this now throughout the entire research spectrum.
Rafal, you were, not to represent a startup voice in these issues, but as you think about, some of these things are big ticket items, big grants, big research institutions, big agencies, Discover's a big firm. Where do you see yourself playing a role in tapping some of the energy that's trying to accelerate the industry's progress?
Yeah, I think we're everybody in kind of sitting here right now is really fortunate because they're at the start of this. There isn't very many people in the world right now that are, I'm going to say, quantum aware or quantum experts, meaning that everybody has a place at the table. There's definitely more people that are interested in getting expertise and guidance on it than there are people that are able to develop or provide that. Maybe I want to shift a little bit from your question. One of the big risks I see is the fact that certain governmental bodies actually aren't building that expertise quickly enough, and especially how it pertains to finance. I really worry about things like regulators, for example, becoming quantum aware, just because there's a real risk. Like right now, we are in this pre-competitive space where we're all friends, and most of the research around algorithms, around hardware, is public. But if somebody does develop a true application to for quantum computing and finance, it's not going to be public. They're going to hang on to it, and there's a real possibility to disrupt the market quite substantially. And I'm worried that at that point the regulators will come down with a really heavy fist and start to regulate, to the point that innovation will slow down. So on that, three-party public, private, public type of partnership, really what I'd like to get involved is maybe some of the other agencies that don't normally think about quantum, but really have the potential down the line to impact its development pretty heavily.
So again, a point of personal privilege, and I would love to there's a number of questions in the chat that speak to sort of the ethical output and the potential for bias. I think I'm going to cover that here. One of the challenges we faced in the Obama administration had been, how do we upskill the regulatory agencies when it's not realistic for the regulator to hire, in this example, a quantum expert? That's a misallocation of resources today. So what is the regulatory framework for emerging technologies? And I do believe there's an opportunity for P33 and this community to really kind of upfront frame kind of an on-ramp or rules of the road that would allow us to sort of get through before we get to heavy-handed regulation that sort of assumes everything and locks us in. And that's why this Raghu's comment about anti-money laundering, I'm not sure how well educated the regulators at Treasury who own the problem are with respect to whether this approach meets the bar, is eligible, complies. I don't know enough about the circumstance, but a forum like what we're doing today is well positioned to communicate. So maybe I'll take that as a question to the group. When should there be a memorandum of on-ramp regulatory flexibility, whatever the expression is? When should there be some guidance on how to incorporate quantum within the regulatory agencies? It's very similar to the decree around AI, which is what's currently been deployed. Anyone think there should be an action around this in 3 years, in 5 years, sooner than that? I'm curious if anyone's had any reaction. I'll throw it out there. Yeah, Yianni.
Yeah, so I definitely think it should be sooner rather than later. I mean, even right now, because I think technology is moving at an ever accelerating pace. And what we're seeing with quantum computing is basically quantum computing is able to take advantage of everything that has already been built in the classical world. I mean, we already have quantum computers on the cloud, right? And, that's not, so some people sometimes equate quantum computing to classical computing back in the 50s or 60s, but that's not really a good analogy. Yes, we don't know, to Rafal's point, what the transistor is yet for quantum computers, but it seems things are evolving by leaps and bounds, and we're using like the entire classical, arsenal to our advantage to progress things. So I do think these regulatory discussions need to happen very, very quickly, because things will be up and running basically as soon as they're available. They will be up and running, right? So
and to push on your question, I'm a guest in this home. I don't spend my time dedicated to these research centers. Is that conversation happening, and where is it happening?
Yeah, I do think there is some conversation happening in bodies that are essentially coalitions bodies, like, for example, the QEDC, right? The Quantum Economic Development Consortium. And I think that's the right place for right now. And there is, I think, already some discussion going on, but it would help to have more voices there. I do see potentially P33 playing a role in, influencing basically that discussion. But it has started, right? And I think that's a good development.
Liang?
Yeah, so I have something to add. I think that I was also part of this the NSF ERC Emergent Research Center led by University of Arizona, and over that part there is one thrust which is actually about like a kind of the social response, and also there's a like a legal efforts kind of try to make sure that when new technology emerges, how kind of we should like make sure our legal system is kind of compatible or like updated with this new technology. Yeah, so I think it's actually it's part of that effort, and people are start thinking about it. Yeah.
And why I'm asking that question is, so poor Raghu is over here from Discover, right? He's the lone real world like dude who's got responsibilities here, and you're kind of swooping in. I'm not so sure, Raghu, you're on speed dial with the team at the University of Arizona thinking about these questions. So I one of the reason I asked the question is there a role for a collaborative where while that's happening, Liang, it may be happening in a vacuum, and having Discover's voice at the table, and I'm putting you as a proxy for, call it whatever, Goldman, everybody else. I just wonder if a goal of this, the reason we're having this forum today and what's happening in Chicago, whether there's an opportunity for the coalition or the community to take on some of these dot connecting exercises. Raghu, for example, are you participating in or aware of the sort of, I mean, the NSF blessing suggests that it's going to be a high quality project. The question is there a linkage to what you would think of as industry demand?
I would say it started, but not to the extent we would, envision if we want to speed up the things. But the core here for me or any other financial industry would be, what's the most practical problem to go for and which has more wide applications? It could simply boil down to, handling a massive amount of data with new variables making an impact to the algorithms. It could go back to the cryptography, which Dr. Fefferman was talking about the data, right? So yes, we have started getting involved, but these kind of conversations would definitely help us to become more and more real and more coming to this common ground of where to start from.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's like a industry code of conduct or a statement of principles that as we introduce these capabilities, we're going to be mindful of impacts on bias and this concept of like, unhackable, cryptography. I don't know what it is, but there may be a set of guiding principles that move the industry together.
Specifically on bias, that's more of a question when we are, bias can be treated, if you're talking about fraud and AML type of applications, bias might not be such a concern when it comes to the way algorithm is deciphering. Their accuracy is more important, right?
Friendly pushback, Raghu. If it turns out your false positive rates disproportionately put friction in front of the poor, the underserved, there may be a scenario where while the goal is to stop bad things, the harm may be false positives that are disproportionate.
So I'm getting to that. What I'm saying is that there are two parts to the bias. One is algorithm bias, and then there's the data bias, right? So that itself demands a huge respect of time to really talk about it more intelligently, right? And that's what I mean by getting back to more real, more practical issues, which will get us to certain solutions.
And I want to be mindful of the clock, folks. We're going to be here for another maybe 5-10 minutes. So we can now get into the other topics that maybe we haven't yet discussed. But maybe if I may ask on some of this, are there areas where the group assembled today could take some action? Is there a call to action at a forum like this? I'm invited as a new guest to your forum. Maybe you all hang out regularly, and so this thing just naturally occurs and we're having one more conversation. Is there something about this gathering that merits maybe a bit of a call to action? And if so, what would you ask that call to be about as we go through this sort of final stretch of conversation? And no pressure if you don't have anything to ask, but I'd be curious if there are any. And Rafal, I may turn to you because you're on my upper left-hand corner. You're my first. Now I go to Kevin.
For me, it's definitely, we've done this in the FI space with different technologies and standing up these sandbox environments where startups, large enterprises can work with regulators and FIs in order to build out solutions and build understanding. I want to say you won't get a sense of what's happening by talking about it. You really have to do it. The other thing that's a huge danger for me with quantum, which is very different than most other technologies, there's a real threat of it arriving all at once. With AI and ML, we had, a decade of FIs onboarding, of figuring it out, while it was still fairly, I would say, developing and immature as a technology in terms of what it could provide. With quantum, there's a real risk that, we saw if somebody develops a quantum Monte Carlo algorithm and hardware to go along with it, the competitive advantage they would get in the market would be huge and potentially for quite some time. So the action item for me is to bring more FIs and more regulators to the table, and to somebody like P33 maybe to build a quantum sandbox that would allow all these parties to work together and build knowledge together.
Raghu, would you enjoy participating in such a thing?
Yes, I would second that.
Kevin, you had your hand up. You want to comment about a call to action? You're on mute, Kevin.
Sorry. Two things I would I think about is, one is collaboration. As I mentioned, I think it's going to become a more competitive industry. There's going to be some fallout, winners and losers. And I think there's strength in numbers. And so, not just the hardware software collaborations, partnerships, also what I think might be the shrinking in funding over time. So there's a reason, I think, for companies to get together officially or unofficially. And then the other thing I worry about is intellectual property. A call to action. The United States is one of the few countries that protect software. So for my industry, I worry about my ability to protect my intellectual property legally, and what can you do to at least scare away people who could pretty easily, review an academic paper or come out with a product that's virtually identical. So those are the two things I would suggest.
Pranav, you've been a little quiet. I gotta call you into this conversation, so please share.
Sure. Yeah, I'll maybe add another regulatory dimension that I think is really important for us to be aware of and talking about, which is as it relates to national security. And in particular, folks may be aware that quantum computing is likely being added sooner than later to an export controls list. And this will have some very clear ramifications. And then there's a lot of gray areas too. So I think Yianni mentioned there's this Quantum Economic Development Consortium that a few of us are members of, and we have had some discussions there around what exactly this means. But there's a lot of haziness there. So there's some things that we'd like to get clarity on. For example, Xanadu is in Canada, and we love the software and hardware that they have, but we want to make sure that the sort of regulation that comes out of this doesn't impose any barriers in working with the best companies out of Canada and France. On the other hand, there's a lot of sensitivity around hiring folks from certain countries where the US does not have such friendly relationships with anymore. And I think that's another dimension of the current regulation that we need to have clarity on sooner than later. Maybe it's the one where we have had the most progress so far, and yet the most progress is needed ASAP. So that's one comment I have to add.
I was going to add that myself, protectionism, and I worry about partnering with Chinese business, Chinese entities that the CFIUS program in the United States, as you suggested, are getting tighter and tighter. I think the politics of it maybe goes away over the next few years. Keep my fingers crossed in November. But I worry about the protectionism as well.
You can't get off the hook by saying we're going to wait for clarity, because I think this is a collaborative gray area where regulators are trying to understand what the art of the possible is. There's broad rules of the road written that could be interpreted one way and have a certain outcome, and interpreted another way with another outcome. And the more there's sort of industry consensus on ways to sort of capture the spirit, but minimize the undue harm, this is an area where it's some forum for that feedback would be very much welcomed. I will tell you, having been in my old job, I would have, like Liang mentioned, this NSF. We love the NSF, right? We love the NSF. We love the Department of Energy. They fund exceptional engineering, exceptional technology. The challenge is, how does one wrestle with that in the context of words on the books for things that, like export controls, that are pretty important. So where there's a consensus on ways in which to tackle these issues, that's not so much don't do anything. It's got to say, we understand the problem, let's do something. That would be critical. Dr. Fefferman, do you want to say anything about where you think the call to action may be? You really did tee up this nice concept of the academic and what's possible.
Yeah, it's something that's certainly needed, right? I talked before about cryptography, and I'm going to say this again. I think that I saw this again and again when I was working for NIST. We were trying to standardize post-quantum cryptography, and I think it's absolutely necessary there that you have everyone talking to each other, right? And I think that's very much what I see we could also contribute in a panel like this, where we can sort of, we all use different language to describe probably similar concepts. And I think what would be so important is to do like what we were doing at NIST, and to try to sort of involve everyone to see what their needs are, and make sure that, for example, as academics, we're sort of addressing those needs as well as we can.
Who have I not captured in this last round? Raghu, you have to write the big check as the industry guy. So you want to say anything about, the things that you inspire you to do something?
I'd like to continue this dialogue first and foremost. It was great to meet all of the panelists here, and if you're really serious about it, hopefully P33 can corral all of us together, and with more financial industry also. I need my company also. So with that, we can go from here, I guess.
Who's got a final couple words before you wrap? Liang and Yianni, you wanna wrap us up and bring us home?
Well, maybe I just say one short thing. I think it's one thing important is to have more conversations, because even when we prepare this engineering research centers, we have a law professor from University of Arizona, and she's actually very open-minded to learn about the quantum and to really appreciate what are the challenges and what the potential social impact. And I think it will be really helpful to have more of these conversations so that the people will understand better, so that we can make something more sensible. Yeah.
Yianni, you may get the last word, man.
Yeah, I'm only going to say that, and I don't want to open a can of worms, but something that wasn't mentioned before, to the universities and the academics, right? So now you have a lot of academics actually have moved over to vendors, right? I mean, there are still academics, obviously, still owning part of academic institutions. I do sense there is a little bit of competition, right? I mean, obviously, we might be going after the same amount of government funding, or we might want to attract the attention of the hardware vendors. But I do feel there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate as well, right? So so I do get a sense there is a little bit, especially with software, right? So software, quantum algorithms, and academic computer scientists, right, that are doing kind of the same research. I do feel there is a little bit of competition, but just wanted to highlight that there is enough room for everyone to work with, and I think we're going to get a lot more by collaborating.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for just contributing to a really robust discussion today. I will say that the artificial intelligence federal R&D roadmap is not a bad one to think about analogies. Yianni, that's where this tension has been. Where does industry come? Where does the academic community come? How do they balance? So there may be use cases that naturally involve public, private, public options here that may be the path forward. My takeaway on the financial sector is the anti-money laundering and fraud use cases just really do crystallize the mind about the opportunity, and that may be a B to sort of public academia to back to the agency kind of approach. So let me thank you all for this really robust discussion. I'm going to lean on the P33 crowd to take some next steps and notes to see if they want to facilitate this dialogue. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you on next steps.
We absolutely will. And thank you so much for teeing up the work that we need to do over the next few years.